Hi, my name's Ian and welcome back to my channel, and I thought I'd do an unscripted ramble, especially in light of the View Over the My View series that seems to be proving quite popular, so that's good. Instead of just focusing on my views, I thought I would go through some of my favourite source books, campaign source books, setting source books, whatever you want to call them. Now, my initial intent was to do this in a kind of top 10 way, and then I realised that that's not going to work because they're all sort of different ways that they are favourites and things like that, and so absolutely categorising them into a top 10 list wasn't going to work, so I decided not to. So there are obvious favourites in there, and that will come out as we, well, probably, as we talk about them. Now, I've set a couple of criteria in the ones that I've chosen. So the two basic criteria are they need to capture the flavour of the setting that they're describing really well. So in a usable, enthusiastic way, so that as a games master or referee or whatever the hell you want to call it, coming into that setting, reading that book, that doesn't just tell you about the setting but also gives you a flavour of the setting and inspires your games mastering, dungeon mastering, whatever, of the setting, and gets the feel of it. So that's one thing. The other one is as few rules, statistics, whatever, specific to the game as possible. Now, I get that if a game setting detracts from the core rules for the game on which that setting is built for too much, then you're going to have to put some more flavour stuff in there. In Dungeons and Dragons, probably class options, subclass type things. In second edition D&D, it would be more about kits and so on. But from the perspective of this, the fewer of those kind of things, the better. And one of the reasons I say that is because for me, a campaign book that advertises itself as saying 30 new classes, 50 new subclasses, 1,000 new spells or whatever, that's not advertising a good setting to me. What that's saying to me is that most of the book in which I'm going to be buying is going to be additions to the core rules and not about the setting itself. So that's the criteria. Defines the setting, gives you the flavour of it, doesn't get too mechanical about, you know, here is a class that belongs to this setting, blah 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 blah. Let's not talk about the setting itself, but talk about alterations to rules in order to make the setting work in whichever system you're using. Right. So that being said, I've got a stack of them over here. Can't remember how many they are. I think there's like 10 or 11. I could have gone even further. Hopefully I'll only spend a couple of minutes or so on each one. So don't expect in-depth reviews of any of these. Some of them will come up in the View Over the My View setting stuff where we sort of delve into. Some already have. Not so much the books themselves, but the setting that they are part of or they show. So if any of these things that come up or anything associated with them that come up that you do want me to delve into a bit deeper, then let me know and I will shove it on the to-do list. Okay, so the first one is West End Games movie trilogy source book for West End Games D6 Star Wars. I'm obviously of the age where I grew up with those original 3 movies. I went to see the first movie when I was... Those that know me know how old I am, but when it came out, we went to... My dad took me to a movie in London, a really flash movie theatre, and it just bit me for life. So the Star Wars movie trilogy sourcebook deals with those original 4 movies, what we now know as episodes 4, 5 and 6. And it breaks them down by the movies themselves. So you've got chapters on can read that. You've got chapters on A New Hope, you've got a chapter on The Empire Strikes Back, and you've got a chapter on The Return of the Jedi. There are, nice little glossy thing about the movie posters in the middle, there are statistics in here. So there are, like, for example, there you've got the game statistics from 8080. But by and large, it is probably equally usable as a fan work or a reference work for a fan of the movies as to some of the finer points and details of the system, of the setting, as depicted in those movies. And you know, you got a bit more background on bounty hunters and all this kind of thing. So you've got game statistics. The game statistics are kept to a minimum. Most of it is prose discussion about the movies and the plot points, and there are some lovely little essays that sort of flesh out some of the things that were going on in the background that weren't necessarily the foreground story of the main characters in the movie. And for example, a little girl lost. It's about something on what they're going on about on Bespin, and it just gives you a flavour of what Bespin is like. And you know, in the criteria of giving you a flavour of the setting, this book is really good, really good. Written by, I don't think you'll be surprised to know that although Bill Slavicsek was not one of the main authors and designers of the work, he is in the credits, and he is still recognised as a major source of information on Star Wars. So I think it's a great book. You know, some concept art from the actual movies in the back, and same from A New Hope, and so it is really good. As from both a fan of the movies and from a player of West End Games Star Wars role-playing game. Yeah, and equally because, again, there are game statistics in there, but that's not the primary focus of it, and so from that aspect, it can be used with FFG's System 2 as a inspiration source and so on. So yeah, that's my first pick in all of this. Again, not a top 10, put them in any order you like, but that's mine first. So West End Games, Star Wars Movie Trilogy Sourcebook for West End Games D6 Star Wars. Let's move on. And this is one, God, if anyone have seen my office from that direction, then you'll know why trying to find flat surfaces to put books down on afterwards is a interesting escapade. Right, so this has come up on View of the Milieu, and I would be a bit remiss not to include it here since I enthused about it there, but it's the second edition version of the City of Adventure for Fritz Lieber's Lankhmar setting. The statistics you've got are fairly minimal. You've got shorthand statistics, game statistics for non-player characters and so on. There's not really much in the way of additionals. It focuses mainly on, descriptions. The highlighting is mine, by the way. Descriptions of parts of the city. The glorious colour map of the city, which I think is one of the best and game usable maps of Lankhmar ever produced. It's the same map that is, excuse me, it's the same map that's in the first edition version. So there's no difference there, including these sort of grey areas in which a games master is expected to shove these sort of geomorph things or invent his own, which means that you can change the city around or come up with your own ideas to fill them. The most pages of game statistics are second edition monster stats at the back, and that is about it from the gaming stuff, like the NPC stats and monster sheets, and that's about it. The rest is really good. What steps this apart more than the first edition version. Oh, the first edition version is up there somewhere. Yeah, so my battered copy of the first edition one. So in the first edition one, you do have you do have the same sort of, you know, character statistics and so on. There's the map, and you do have, you know, monster stats and everything else. You do have those little sub maps as a part of a booklet. But what sets the second edition version apart, for me, is the references. So for example, non-player character, here we go, opened it up, you've got the stats block and description for Sis with SOL written next to them, which means that character appears in the Swords of Lankhmar, so one of the novels in the series. So you've got, in this book, as well as describing various bits and pieces of the city, they have cross-references back to the original stories and one novel. So that it's great. Again, it's one of those, like the movie Trilogy Sourcebook. It's a book for fans of the series, as well as, in this case, players of second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Although, because the statistics are kept to a minimum, you could use it alongside the Dungeon Crawl Classics, which currently do a Lankhmar campaign setting and some very good adventures with that. And what else? Savage Worlds, they do a Lankhmar version, or even 5th edition D&D, whatever. This is one of the reasons why that criteria, a minimal amount of game stats, is really important for me, because as editions and games change, it doesn't make books like this irrelevant. The game stats in them, the tiny part of the books that are game stats, do become irrelevant if you change game systems, but the bulk of the books don't. So that's great. It's another one I picked. Lankhmar City of Adventure for 2nd edition AD&D. Fantastic work. Right. Next up, the Midderlands. Now this little tiny book is actually fantastic. Right. So books, the maps themselves. You obviously know by my accent and everything else that I'm a Brit. There's a map of the, well, what do they call it? The Haven Isles in this particular thing. But the Midderlands campaign setting focuses on the Midlands. And there you go. The Midlands campaign map. And if you prefer your hexes and stuff, it's the same map on the other side. So two reasons why I like this. It's kind of a dark humour way. If you like Monty Python, if you like Monty Python and the Holy Grail, that sort of dark, offbeat, strange humour, that is expressed in this campaign setting. Really well. Love it. And it's also, it covers this sort of area that I live. So there's quite a lot of familiarity in some of the in-jokes that it makes through. But it's, you know, the sort of standard Dungeons and Dragons style maps for cities and so on. There are some stats in here. Most of the stats are for things like Swords and Wizardry and whatever, the OSR type of games, retro clones and so on. But again, they're kept to a minimum. This book could be used with virtually any game system that you choose to play, and in fact have made use of this book alongside BRP, which personally I think suits the setting a lot better than the OSR games. But you know, you've got some monster statistics, and again, that's about as far as it goes into game stuff itself. Mostly it is about campaign descriptions, and the book itself it's like an A5 small book. It is hardback. It is absolutely you know, absolutely gorgeous. And yeah, I just think it's fantastic. If you want to, right, here's a good. This is the index, right? So it's a tiny little A5 book with a monstrous index to it. So that kind of tells you the amount of information that they have packed into such a small thing. And like I said, dark humour, very Monty Python-esque, very British, and just a wonderful delight to both read and play. It's a fun old thing. So kudos. Who wrote it? I mean, let's go and give them some. Let's go and give them some love, shall we? Glyn Seal, Edwin Nagy, and Mark Nolan. So apologies to them if I've pronounced their names wrong. This particular one is the Midderlands Expanded. So, you know, I'll put a link in the description so you can get it hold of. It's not based on any franchise, and it's yeah, delight to have a little play around with. Fun old thing. Right, next up. Now, this is where we get into flavour, capturing the flavour, especially when the setting is not, or departs from, sorry, where the setting departs from the default flavour of the game system, game rules, is meant to depict, right? So, this is the Dark Sun, 2nd edition. This is the revised campaign box set from the 2nd edition campaign setting Dark Sun. So brief potted history of the release of the campaign setting. It was originally released for 2nd edition, then they expanded it after a bit of history and supplements and everything else got under its wing, and it proved to be popular, and then at the end of 2nd edition that was it. It's then made a brief reappearance into 4th edition, and you know, I think it's one of those. It's a bit like Spelljammer in the fact that it's so far off the normal beaten track for the sort of pseudo-medieval, pseudo-renaissance fantasy that Dungeons and Dragons has as its default. It's a really, really intense setting. A lot of survival. Survival in a post-apocalyptic, magical post-apocalyptic world. Really harsh setting, cannibalistic halflings. Brilliant stuff, you know. Now, inside my particular box, there is both the stuff from the original set and the stuff from the 2nd edition set. That's because I use stuff, and when you use stuff, it tends to wear out and fall apart. And one of the first things that ever goes on me are the original boxes. Plus, you know, I've moved around and everything else, and these books and box sets and everything else have come with me. So, it's really difficult to keep certain things in pristine conditions, especially the things that tend to end up with me, that tend to end up in pristine condition, are those things that I have hardly used. And usually I've hardly used them because I don't like them. I bought them because I went through a phase of just buying virtually everything that TSR kicked out. But that's beside the point. What makes the revised version better than its original version and its 4th edition version, because remember the 4th edition version is more about depicting the Dark Sun rules. So there's an adventure in there, there's some rules for 4th edition stuff in there and so on in the 4th edition version of the campaign settings. It doesn't have a massive amount of space to deal with the actual setting itself. Similar to the 5th edition Spelljammer thing, you know, that Spelljammer 5th edition Spelljammer campaign box loses out because it doesn't really give over, or doesn't have space, doesn't give itself enough space to do justice to the Spelljammer setting. The 4th edition Dark Sun book is a similar problem, although the 4th edition Dark Sun book does a damn sight better job than the 5th edition Spelljammer book. But this book This is in the in the revised Dark Sun thing. This book is the bit that makes it. Bill Slavicek again, but this is really just a prose. There's no game stats in here whatsoever. It's just purely about prose. It's written from a perspective of the world itself. Someone that actually lives in a world. There's little bits of snippets of things that are written in there, and it's just really good. So it actually covers virtually the whole of the setting itself, it's nice. So you've got a rule book which is very gamey, about the different kinds of equipment and everything else that's in the set, because it is obsidian weapons and wood and bone armor and that kind of thing, which is off the beaten track of Dungeons and Dragons. So there is a rule book, but here we're talking about, what is it, 96? Yeah, 96 page rule book in a box that has, there's a full 128. There's page numbers. Come on. Full 128 page book on. There's just pure prose, no game stats, written in a first person kind of way. So it gives over the feel of the place, and while giving you the information about the place, and it's absolutely brilliant. The equivalent for the original set is this, which again, the Wanderer's Journal. This is sort of 96 pages and gave you a load of the monster. So the monster book, or the monster section, was in that original Wanderer's Journal thing, which sort of detracts from the kind of the purpose from the first one, but the revised set very much improved on that. And then you've got with that an adventure. It's only a small 32 pages, is it? Yeah, 32. So you get a 32 page adventure, which is again in the original set you didn't get that. You just got your 2 books and there was an adventure in the flipbook format, which I can't like. Sorry, there's all sorts of some and a rule book in the second edition one that you get. You got a story in the first one. Anyway, you got these flipbook format of adventures, which lasted for a handful of adventures, and I think it's quite good. But anyway, digressing from all of that and starting to delve into something I promised I wasn't going to do, which was to revise the actual review the actual set itself. But no, the revised and expanded version of the second edition of Dungeons and Dragons Dark Sun campaign setting. Absolutely fantastic. If you're a fan of Dark Sun, you should have this. Right, next up we have the BattleTech one. Now, one of the things that BattleTech has, obviously, it has its periods of warfare. If you don't know what BattleTech is, basically it is a game of giant stompy robots beating the crap out of each other. But it really does. The setting concept itself goes into a lot of Machiavellian politics between the major powers, and each of the factions has very distinct characters, and then there's the sort of question of eugenics of the clans, and so the history goes back a long way. The basis of the history is obviously to lay down the foundations for a bunch of different things that you can paint your mechs in and then go and fight them on a tabletop. So there is a reason in a war game for having all of these factions and then giving them a bit of backstory. But and I say that without cynicism. That's entirely the point of a war game of that sort of nature. So what I've done with these conflicts and eras and everything else, there are a number of books that BattleTech has. If you're interested in the history, if you read the novels, then those novels you can tap into by buying sourcebooks that cover the ground of the novels and so on. So there's a lot of background material available for the BattleTech game that is not necessarily rules. So you got a whole bunch of rule books that go into the game, and what you can do with the units and everything else, and you can quite happily play BattleTech with just the rules and not worry about the background source at all. But there is quite a deep, rich source book based background to them as well, and a whole sled of novels. So it was, for me, a BattleTech source book, background book, whatever, had to make it into this particular video. So I just had to choose which one I thought was the best of those, and for me it is this one. So the FedCom Civil War. Reason being, they tried, up until this point, they tried numerous different formats to show eras and battles, and major wars that span several planets and so on. And I think this is the first one where they got that right. So previous to this, you got there's the Naeus Atlas of the fourth Succession War. There are a few other bits and pieces that go into the clan invasion and so on. So there's a number of different source books. Some dealing with wars on particular planets, and some dealing with wars in limited areas of space and so on. But they had to do something different because the Federated Commonwealth Civil War covered a large area of the Inner Sphere being the default setting for BattleTech. And in order to represent that, they had to do something a little bit out of the box, and that's exactly what they did. It's quite a large 218, am I reading that wrong, 216 page book that goes into, there's a lot of maps in here that show you the theatres of war and what units were doing when. There's a lot of some of the political history that was going on at the time, some of the build-up of it, some of the things. These tables, which, there's quite a few of these kind of things that just show you which unit was where at what time, how much damage it took. It goes into quite a breakdown of analysis. If you've ever gone and picked up any history books or whatever about, say, World War II or anything like that, you kind of get the same feel out of this. It's dealt with in the same level of detail, the same sort of meticulous descriptions of things. So I think this book, it also, from this book on, the way in which the guys, be it, this was done under FanPro. Okay, so the ways that FanPro and Catalyst have put source books together that show wide-scale conflicts, the way that they have done them has sort of followed this similar kind of template way. So this for me it's kind of informed a next generation of this is how we do things. And there's things like Brush Wars and everything else that came after that used a similar template to go and examine historical BattleTech wars. Very, very, very little in the way of game statistics. There's some advice at the back, in the back few pages of the book, about how to make a campaign of it or to use it in gaming, but very, 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 very little of that going on in here. Brilliant source book for the BattleTech game, and particularly for this period, and a great moulder of the direction BattleTech source books took going forward. So that's that one. Next up, after a brief sip of tea, now, one of the game systems that sadly has passed on, but I think stood at the pinnacle of the depiction of a published world, a literary world, franchise, whatever, that has never been surpassed, to my mind, is the Middle-earth role-playing game, which we will cover on this channel, both in View of the My View and in the sort of general, let's go and talk about and break down a rule system. But the setting books for it and the maps, especially Pete Fenlon's maps, are absolutely gorgeous. And even though there have been several ones. There's one either out or coming out for 5th edition D&D or whatever. I firmly believe that 5th edition D&D is the wrong rule system for showing that particular world, but whatever, someone's got the license to do it, so they're going to do it. But those source books, those Iron Crown Enterprise source books, I don't think have ever been surpassed in their meticulous detail of taking Tolkien's work and building on it, and that's what we have. So again, this is one of mine. Well, one of them is going to be in there, just a case of which one. So I cheated and picked one that is a compilation of 2 previous ones, which is Mirkwood, which was originally published as Northern Mirkwood and Southern Mirkwood. So this book is a compilation of 2 previous Iron Crown source books. But it's great. Let me show you the maps first. I mean, it's just, look at that. Have I got it the right way up? Yes. So this is Southern Mirkwood, and hopefully it will show you a little bit about how that. It's just absolutely gorgeous, and even things for, you know, towns and site locations and stuff. They are absolutely gorgeous, and the best thing about them is they are artistic without detracting from their use as a game tool, or a games mastering tool or whatever. You get a lot of maps these days that focus more on the artistry of the map than they do on the functionality of the map, and I think that's a shame. I love a good map. I love a good map to look at. That's absolutely fantastic. But if it is overly artistic and the art then means that it's usable, you can put it on the wall and it's great, but as actually using it as a map, pointless, right? So these Pete Fennon's map work mixes the two absolutely sublimely. The maps are gorgeous and they are absolutely fantastically usable. And the best things about these books, and most of the Iron Crown books, is there's a whole sled of, you know, maps and information and descriptions and, you know, all sorts of stuff. You know, this is what the animal breakdown is like, and the fauna and flora, and yeah, tons of information. It's absolutely brilliant. But they've, in virtually every single one of them, beyond the rule books, they limit their gaming stuff to a sort of here are some game terms. If you're not using this with either Rollmaster or Middle-earth role playing, here are some game terms and bits and pieces you might not be familiar with, but we're going to mix it in with some Middle-earth terms too. And here is a bit of a conversion table depending on what form of stats you use, and if you're using a D% or a D20 system or whatever. And that's about it. Until you get to the back, where it actually then does all your game stats. So the last few pages of Middle-earth role-playing books from Iron Crown give you all the game stats, and the intervening, you know, that much of the book is all about the setting. So you've got a handful of pages at the front and the back, and the rest is system neutral, and very well written and very loving, I think, towards the Middle-earth franchise, which I don't think has been captured quite so well in other iterations of role-playing and wargaming within Middle-earth. So yeah, the Mirkwood set, the campaign book, whatever, source book, bit of a cheat, compilation of 2, but any of the Iron Crown Middle-earth setting books are, if you're a Tolkien fan, you can just dive into the sumptuousness. It was actually a close call because the Minas Tirith book is one of my favourites as well, but you know, I cheated and got a 2-for-1 instead. Okay, next is we have Now, this is, I don't know if this is a bit of a cheat or not, but I have gone for something that is sort of repeated several times in different formats, right? So this, but not so much this. This, but not so much this, although this is actually improvement on the glossography. And this. Now they all are iterations of the same thing, essentially. But they are, in very few pages, 80 pages for this particular edition of it. It describes, in short form, and enough information. I go into this. There's a view of the Miley one on Greyhawk, but it's enough information for a DM to go and pick the world of Greyhawk up and hammer it into their own, get a sense and feel of the system, of the world, and play it without being bogged down with too much detail. So I think it's great. A little further down, we'll come to a world where there is detail galore, but it's in a different kind of way. So for me, this is brilliant. This is from a Dungeons and Dragons perspective. This is enough information to get you going with a campaign setting, get the feel for it, and go for it. Right. This is more or less the same book. The information is updated. They've expanded some entries, and someone's just sent me an email. But it's the actual stuff itself is pretty much the same. Other than I've added more notes to it than in the other one, and apparently coloured the map in. But hey ho, that's what I do. Like I say, these books are books I use rather than, or have used rather than have to go through. The Living Greyhawk Gazetteer for the 3rd edition D&D pretty much does the same thing. The only difference really here is that they expand out some of the things. I'm trying to find one of the longer entries. Yeah, so the statistics side of things, there's a bit more of a breakdown in that, which is, it falls along the lines of the 3rd edition Dungeon Master's Guide rulebook, where they're saying, here are some templates that you can use to go and delve into depicting statistics for cities and countries and so on, and so they picked up on that and used it within this book, which is why it is 192 pages. But the information is pretty much the same. Again, it's updated though to the year. Each one of each iteration of the Greyhawk setting, they've advanced the timeline of it. And just a bit of a shout out to those. I'm going to be delving into these. The WGR 4, 5 and 7, although WGR 7 didn't actually exist, but we'll come on to that. But I will be going through these in a bit of depth as a sort of an addendum to my view of my new Greyhawk one, because I think these are some of the best and most concentrated, yes, a lot of information packed down, focused campaign sourcebook releases ever. Carl Sargent is a very good writer, in my opinion. Right, so that's Greyhawk. So generally speaking, the 1st edition World of Greyhawk campaign setting is what I'm on about here. I'm just sort of wittering on about other versions of that particular book. Right, so on to another sort of another one of the big Dungeons and Dragons campaign settings, but the book that I think has the problem. Right, so it's the 3rd edition Forgotten Realms book, right? Now the reason why I say this, even though there's a good chunk of it, let's say up to oh, come on. Yeah, so there's a good chunk of it. That first section of the book there is pretty much all rules. Yeah, prestige classes, spells, that sort of stuff. Feats, character generation, races, and so on. The rest of it is a breakdown of of the world, of various places and various whatnot. And it goes into, I mean, the Forgotten Realms for me is, it goes into strange areas of minutiae in some areas, and then absolute expanses of non-minutiae. I don't know. How would you call it? There are some strange omissions in detail in certain areas, and some strange focuses in detail in others. But essentially, for me, well, there you go, massive, great realms map with all the political boundaries. So yeah, it goes into geography and everything. What's that one? Trade routes. So you can also tell if I like a book or not is by how many bits of paper are stuffed into it. What am I trying to say? So take the first edition book. Okay, let's go from this. There are two game worlds in Dungeons and Dragons, or back in from the 80s and 90s. They're very, very similar, and just stay with me a little bit on this one. One is the Forgotten Realms, and one is Mystara. And part of the reason why Mystara isn't around anymore, by and large, is because the Realms and Mystara are too closely related. They're too similar, and the only things that they are both effectively amalgamations of of parallels to real world cultures, what have you. So if you look at the Realms, you've obviously got sort of medieval Europe in Cormier and the Dale lands and so on. You've obviously got something that's resembling of the Italian peninsular Renaissance stuff, where you've got the different families and cities who had their own little city-states in their Baldur's Gate and down. You've got Am, which is kind of like a Spanish thing around about the period of the conquistadors, which then tied into the Mazteca stuff. You've got the Horde lands, which is obviously Mongol. You've got Zakhara, which is obviously Arabian. You've got Shulang, which is obviously China, and so on, right? So all of these things are squished together into a campaign setting that has got all sorts of cultural themes to it that have real world parallels. And in Mystara, you have Thyatis, which is roughly Rome. You have Ethengar, which is the Mongols again. You've got the Northern Reaches, which is Scandinavian. Similarly, you've got like Luskan and the northern areas of that, and Icewind Dale and stuff, which has got a Scandinavian feel to it. Does to me. You've got a halfling realm, the Shires in Mystara. You've got Lurien in the Forgotten Realms. You have I'm trying to think of some of the ones that are just directly paralleled with each other, rather than going through. I mean, things like the Borderlands. So Darrakin, I think, for me feels very similar to Baldur's Gate and the Sword Coast, at least in theme. I mean, these are not precise things, but they're in the general themes that derive them, and they are all. Let's take a real world culture. Let's make a fantasy version of that. Let's put it into a world. The realms, they sort of fit better because they're given more space to actually live and breathe in their own right. In Mystara, they're very much like compact in that known world map, although later bits of Mystara expanded on from that. So yeah, well, I mean, I'll deal with Forgotten Realms more, and I'm sort of rambling a bit more about about it then. But the Forgotten Realms effectively became, especially once the Dungeons and Dragons, rather than the advanced Dungeons and Dragons, the Dungeons and Dragons game, BCMI, BX, whatever, was the focus began to be taken down, especially during Wizards' first 10 years from 97 on, and then we haven't really gone back to Mystara since. But we have gone and revisited the Forgotten Realms. Now this book, over the original campaign setting, so the campaign setting from the first edition and the campaign setting from second edition, of which they did 2 revisions, are pretty much of a muchness. They go and just try and they splat you with a lot of similar to the Greyhawk things, a lot of sort of small entries and things, and then they give you absolute minutiae detail on certain areas, some of which are understandable because they're a core area campaign, so they'll let Dalelands call me, that's fine, but then you'll get some random place in the middle of nowhere that obviously someone has in the TSR offices at the time had run a campaign over. So then you've got a menu from it's a random scattering. There's no consistency in the detail that you're given for across the board. If you're going to have a detailed campaign, have a detailed campaign world, which I'll show you who does that really well in a sec. And if you're going to have an open campaign setting, then have an open campaign setting. Don't try and mix the two, because then it just feels wrong. There's an inconsistency in the books as you try and plough your way through them. Of all the Forgotten Realms books that detail the campaign setting, not when it goes into individual areas, but when it actually tries to deal with the setting itself and capture the feel of that setting, this book does it best. And the original box sets don't do it as well as this. That's kind of what I'm saying. And really, with this, you can play a Realms campaign alone without anything else. That's pretty much how relatively solid this is. So yes, this is. There's a minor bit of game stuff at the beginning, which taps into the 3rd edition feats and prestige classes and so on else, and then everything else just describes the broad cultures and cultural regions and how the realms works. And if you want to find out about the realms, then this is, I think, the book to go for. Right, I've rambled on about the realms longer than I actually ever wanted to there. Okay, what's next? Sorry, when we say ever wanted to, there will be a view over the menu. In fact, there'll probably be 3 or 4 view over the menus with the realms as we break it down into some component parts. Right, the next bit. So this is not on the list, but it's the precursor to it all. So this is the prelude to the next one. The Wilderlands, regardless of what you think of anyone's particular political view that might happen to own the IP for these particular things, and I can understand and in many ways support that point of view, I don't think it detracts from the usefulness of the material to us that were at the beginning, before we had glossy books and everything else, and the idea of a campaign setting, published campaign setting. Here you go, Dungeon Masters, you don't need to do any of your own work anymore, here's some stuff that's been laid out for you, was quite a foreign idea. But then, Judges Guild came along and proved that it was a thing, and the details in this are really, really light. But what's good about these original ones is these little things here, where what they basically did, it was, in this particular hex on the map, there is this there, or this mystery, or this thing that is the seed to a adventure, potentially. Now, some of it's useful for hex crawling, some of it is useful for just designing a quest around, the adventurers here in a nearby town or whatever, that there's something going on, or something needs to be found. You've picked up a hex, and the details of that hex have inspired you, and you can create a quest around, and the characters hear rumours of what's in that hex, and off they go to investigate it. So this is the kind of start of it. The pinnacle for me, these are perfectly usable, and we've got tons of use out of these things. See the state of my Wilderlands maps. But the pinnacle of these were Necromancer Games D20 version of the Wilderlands. Now, this is not the form that you got this set in, right? So I got it in 2 hardback books. Okay, it did come as a box set with all of the individual map books and everything else. There was a ton of in the box set. There was a ton of maps and a ton of books. Now I've got maps galore on the Wilderlands. So instead of forking out for the box set, I forked out for the PDF and then rearranged them all into 2 hardback volumes, which you know, they follow the order in which the books they set, but the maps themselves were all over the place. So those numbers on the bottom refer to the map numbers that they deal with. Right, so let's just delve into one of them. So this is basically, okay, here we go. This is basically what you get. This is a chapter on Vallon, on the Vallon map. You get some paragraphs or whatever on the geographical features of the map. And then you get page on page. So those lines from the original, where you've got just a line that says, oh, in this hex there is this, a lot of those are expanded out. So instead of just one line that says this, that and the other, these you've got a paragraph. And in many cases, those paragraphs are absolutely fantastic. They've taken the inspiration of it and just really run with it and expanded them out, and you've got a lot more to do. The other things, or a lot more to work with as a DM. Yes, there are game stats in here, like for example, you've got the 3rd edition accepted stat blocks for villagers and things. You haven't really got much in the way of game stuff. What they did as far as gaming kind of thing for the Wilderlands stuff, they kept in a separate volume, which is the Player's Guide to the Wilderlands. So this wasn't part of the set. It's a completely separate book, and in here you find the sort of, you know, character generation stuff and character classes and everything else. But so the game stuff was kept clear of the description. So this is largely system neutral. And just, I mean, look, dense information. The other thing I like about these, so in the old books and I'm not even sure you can get them now because of the things going on, but in the old books you had separation of the village stats, and you got your citadel stats. I think there you go, your citadel stats, and you got your isles and you got your lairs. So all of these things were separated out. So everything that was connected to a hex was separated out into several different lists. One of the beauties is about these Wilderlands, or Necromancers, Wilderlands things, Necromancer Games under the Swords and Sorcery stuff, and the fantasy campaign setting and stuff. It's one of the beauties of this is that all of the hex descriptions are together in order of hex number by map. So if you had in the older days, unless you were very careful about cross-referencing all of the various lists, then it was great to see what villages were where. But if you wanted to see if there was a lair within the same hex as a village, within the citadel or whatever, if you wanted to go and cross-reference all of that, you had to go and look and make sure across all those lists. Yes, it's not a massive, great ball ache to do that, but in this, all of the hexes are in order. So if you are looking at hex 0913 on the Vallon map, say, then all of the entries for 0193 will be in the same area, they'll be together. You know, you get 0193 this village, 0193 this lair, 0193 this particular strange singing tree with sky blue parrots on it, or whatever, you know. So yeah, not sure. I don't think this is available anymore. It's been a while since it was published. Back in 3rd edition. There certainly wasn't a 4th edition one. When was this? This was 2005, so it's a fair while ago. But if you can get hold of the box set, then do it. If you're, I don't know, we'll cover more about the Wilderlands later. But of all of the iterations of the Wilderlands campaign setting, I think this set that I just happened to have print on demanded into 2 hardback books is probably the best of the lot of them. Right, now finally, when I was talking earlier about what it means to have a detailed setting, so we've had, in fantasy terms, I think we've had we've had 2 layers of fantasy. Well, okay, let's take the Wilderlands apart, because I think that's separate. Let's take the top level layer, where you're just describing things in broad brush strokes and leaving it for DMs and whatever to fill things in for themselves. That sort of applies to both Greyhawk and Dark Sun. A lot of the stuff about Dark Sun is thematic rather than detailed. A lot of the stuff about Greyhawk is thematic and the descriptions of the various kingdoms and stuff rather than absolute detail. Then you've got a mid-tier where there's a lot of broad brush stuff over the top, and then some of the details and niggly bits in between are filled in for you, and that gives you more scaffolding, if you want that scaffolding, to be able to build into things. So as an example of that, if you wanted to have to run a sort of trade war, if you let's say there were 2 competing mercantile companies that were having a go at each other in various different ways. In Greyhawk, you would have to pretty much make that a whole cloth. In the Forgotten Realms, you wouldn't, because there are descriptions of trade routes and the companies that use them within the descriptions, within the source material for the campaign setting. So you've got details, you've got another level of detail on from there. When we come to the next one, you've got so much detail. it's partly a games master's wonder, and I coined this term about what was it called? Fantasy archaeology. No, games master DM archaeology, or whatever the term was. It was basically having so many bits of pieces of information all over the place. As a DM, you can enjoy yourself before you've even put adventures or campaigns, stories or whatever together, where you can just go and find these bits of information, and that in itself is a bit of a joy and a bit of an interesting pastime. With this next world, it's that sort of thing is on a completely another level. It's absolutely fantastic. So you need to be fairly strong to go, but it basically is this. Two pretty weighty volumes of material in there. Absolutely zero in the way of game statistics, which is on purpose. There have been 2 rule systems, various editions, but 2 rule systems that have dealt with adventuring in Glorantha. One being RuneQuest, one being HeroQuest, or whatever it happened to be called. Not HeroQuest the board game, but the Hero Wars and HeroQuest that it became known as later. But these books are they don't say anything about the mechanics, but they do obviously tie into some of the things that are then mechanically depicted in the game, but they don't. It's not necessary to Well, it's not necessary to own RuneQuest or HeroQuest or anything to enjoy these books. You just read it as a source book on a world itself. Now this is the next echelon on from the Forgotten Realms, but the thematic stuff in here you won't find, like, well, you will find some maps of some settlements, but these maps, like these, which are from the Argon Agrath Atlas, and which is the Argon Agrath Atlas is more or less just maps, and then this book uses the source from those maps to actually go in and to the detail itself. It's just a gorgeous book to actually delve into, pick little bits out, to actually go in and delve into the history, and especially the mythology and the spirituality and the religions of Glorantha itself. It is just it actually, strangely, about trolls and humanity, but it strangely reminds me of some of the books that I have, textbooks and whatever, on archaeology, which are similarly weighty and similarly detailed. So yes, the guide to Glorantha is well worth having if you're a fan of fantasy worlds, if you are a fan of Glorantha and RuneQuest especially, if you want to see the extent to which a lifelong passion of Greg Stafford can result in, may he rest in peace, but it's largely him being the driving force behind a lot of all of this, and what he came up with is just absolutely brilliant. If you want something a little bit less weighty, then this is the Glorantha source book is something to go for. Again, system agnostic, so there's no game systems here. Gives you a bit about the gods and the religions, and a bit about the geography and history of things. It doesn't use the Argon Atlas for its mapping. If I can find, and it has most focus on the sort of central region of Genitella, which is Dragon Pass, which has been the major focus of many of the bits and pieces for Glorantha itself. I'm just trying to find a region map in here that might not be. Oh, maybe there isn't a region map. I'm sure there was. Oh no, there is, yes, there you go. So that's the sort of region map that you get in the Guide to Glorantha. Again, it focuses on on the Dragon Pass region, which is also that central bit. Whereas the Guide to Glorantha covers the whole world and its various mythologies and everything else. The unified mythology and how that will sort of fit together with everything else. So that's my... there you go, the Guide to Glorantha. Huge work. You can use it as well to do your perception exercise and things. Fantastic book to read from cover to cover. Fantastic book just to delve in casually. It's a fantastic reference if you are playing Glorantha and you hear a reference and you want to look out. Oh, what about them then? What about the Morocanth? And you can go and have a look through those books and read up more on the Morocanth on a casual basis. So fantastic work, fantastic epitaph to Glorantha's designer Greg Stafford, and Glorantha is something that we'll be delving into in View of the Milieu in a bit further down the line. So there you go. They are not all of my favourite campaign reference source books, and not covering all of my favourite campaign settings. but just a selection in no particular order other than the Guide to Glorantha obviously had to round off the video from sheer weight. So it's not really a top 10, but it's a, if I sat down and really did some proper thought out algorithmic mathematics on it, I probably could come up with some way of measuring their use. But they're all very different from each other, and they all describe very different worlds in very different ways. So like I said, those two criteria, minimum amount or even none in the case of the Glorantha stuff, of game statistics in there, effectively, so that they are more about the setting, less about the game, and thereby being usable across whatever game system you want to play. And capturing, effectively, the feel of the game. If not necessarily the detail, the actual feel, emotion, whatever, thematic essence of the setting. Which all of them, I feel, do very well. So that's it for this rambling video. Again, as I said, it's unscripted. I just dragged a whole bunch of stuff off the shelf. I did think about what I was going to grab off the shelf, so it wasn't just a total random selection, but it's, like I said, not a top 10, just a sort of rambling about things I like, things that I think will serve as good examples of campaign settings, and certainly not not within the trend of here's a campaign setting book that is 200 pages long, 150 of those pages being new classes, new races, new spells, new whatever. Right, there we go. So until the next video, I will see you then. Have a great week.